The security footage would later show the exact moment everything changed. 11:47 p.m. Thursday night, when 8-year-old Emma Caldwell came running barefoot down the sterile white corridors of Pinnacle Medical Research Center in downtown Manhattan, her silk pajamas catching the fluorescent lights as tears streamed down her face, and she threw herself at the legs of Marcus Webb, a 62-year-old night janitor who'd been mopping the same hallway for the past 11 years, invisible to every doctor, nurse, and executive who'd ever walked past him without a second glance. "Please help my dad, they're killing him," she sobbed into his worn gray uniform, her small hands clutching the fabric with desperate strength while Marcus stood frozen, mop in hand, because children weren't supposed to be on the 8th floor at this hour, and certainly not the daughter of billionaire pharmaceutical mogul Richard Caldwell, whose name was emblazoned on half the buildings in this city, and whose experimental treatment wing funded Marcus's modest paycheck. The girl looked up at him with eyes that held a terror no child should know, and Marcus felt something ancient stir in his chest, something he'd buried 23 years ago when he'd walked away from everything he'd been before. But before he could speak, before he could ask what she meant, 2 security guards came rushing around the corner, their faces tight with professional concern. "Emma, sweetheart, you need to come back to your father's suite," the taller one said, his voice honey-smooth but his eyes cold as winter steel, and when he reached for her, the little girl pressed herself harder against Marcus, her whole body trembling. "They gave him something," she whispered, loud enough only for Marcus to hear. "I saw them put it in his four when they thought I was sleeping." The tall doctor with the scar on his hand, he told the nurse, "This is what Mr. Whitmore ordered, and my daddy started shaking and I'm scared. Please, you have to help him." Marcus's mind raced because Whitmore was Jonathan Whitmore, CEO of Caldwell Pharmaceuticals and Richard's business partner for 30 years. A man whose face smiled from every company press release and whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary in circles that knew where to look. The security guard's hand closed on Emma's shoulder, firm but not yet forceful, and Marcus made a decision that would unravel everything. He looked the guard straight in the eye and said, "The child seems distressed, perhaps I should accompany you to ensure she's all right," using a tone he hadn't used in over 2 decades, a tone that carried authority from somewhere deep and forgotten. And the guard's eyes flickered with confusion because janitors didn't speak like that, didn't carry themselves with that quiet command. "That won't be necessary," the guard said, but Emma had wrapped her arms around Marcus's leg and wouldn't let go. And in that moment of hesitation, Marcus saw something on the guard's belt radio. A small red light blinking in a pattern he recognized, a frequency used for priority containment protocols, the kind reserved for situations that needed to disappear quietly. "What room is your father in?" Marcus asked Emma gently, crouching down to her level, and she whispered 8147, the corner suite, before the second guard stepped forward, hand moving toward his radio. "Sir, you need to step back and return to your duties," he said, and Marcus could see the calculation happening behind the man's eyes, the weighing of how much force to use on a 62-year-old janitor in front of a child, and Marcus knew he had perhaps 30 seconds before this escalated beyond words. "Emma," he said softly, "I need you to be very brave and go with these men back to your room, but I want you to remember something. If anything happens, if you get scared again, you find me, Marcus Webb, night janitor, 2nd floor break room between midnight and 6 a.m. Can you remember that?" The little girl nodded, tears still streaming, and Marcus gently untangled her arms, watching as the guards led her away, one of them speaking rapidly into his radio in clipped, professional tones. Marcus waited until they turned the corner, then he did something he'd sworn he'd never do again. He pulled out the ancient flip phone he kept in his locker, a phone with exactly one number programmed into it, a number he hadn't called in 23 years, and he typed a single text message, "Pinnacle Medical, 8th floor, possible containment situation, advise." The response came back in under a minute. "Negative, you're dark, maintain cover, no exposure." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted both texts, put the phone back in his locker, and made his second decision of the night. He was going to trust the terrified eyes of an 8-year-old girl over the orders of people who'd forgotten his name long ago. He finished mopping the hallway with methodical precision, nodded to the night supervisor making his rounds, then took his 15-minute break at midnight exactly as he did every night, except instead of sitting in the break room with coffee and yesterday's newspaper, he walked up the service stairs to the 8th floor, using the key card he wasn't supposed to have, the one that had been in his locker since his 3rd week on the job, placed there by someone who'd said, "just in case," and never explained what that meant. The 8th floor at night was a different world. Hushed, expensive, designed for patients who paid more per night than most people earned in a month, with private nursing stations and suites that looked more like hotel rooms than hospital spaces, and Marcus moved through the shadows with the invisibility that 11 years of janitorial work had perfected. Just another maintenance worker checking trash bins and replacing soap dispensers. Room 8147 was at the end of the corridor, a corner suite with double doors and its own security station, currently manned by a bored-looking guard reading something on his phone, and Marcus knew he couldn't just walk up and knock, so he did what invisible people do. He found a reason to be there. He wheeled his cleaning cart toward the suite, moving with the slow, steady pace of someone who'd cleaned this hallway 1,000 times, and when he reached the security desk, he said in his most forgettable voice, "Spill reported in 8147. Night supervisor said to handle it quiet." The guard barely looked up. "Nobody called about a spill," he said, but his attention was already back on his phone, and Marcus made a show of checking a non-existent clipboard. "Got it right here, 11:52 p.m. Juice spill, patient suite," he said, and the guard waved him through with the indifference of someone who'd sat in that chair for too many hours, and Marcus pushed his cart through the doors into Richard Caldwell's suite. The room was dark except for the glow of multiple monitors displaying vital signs, and in the hospital bed lay one of the most powerful men in America, looking nothing like the commanding figure from magazine covers and boardroom photographs. Richard Caldwell was barely conscious, his skin gray, sweat beading on his forehead, and his breathing shallow and irregular, while an 4-pump beside his bed dripped something clear into his arm, and Marcus's eyes, trained by years of experience he wasn't supposed to remember, immediately cataloged the problem. The drip rate was wrong, the solution bag showed signs of having been changed recently, and the man's symptoms suggested something far worse than the pancreatic cancer that had brought him here for experimental treatment. Marcus moved quickly, pulling on the cleaning gloves that wouldn't look suspicious, and he checked the 4-bags label. The medication name was correct, but something about the batch number made him pause, made him pull out his phone and snap a quick photo, and then he heard it. Footsteps in the corridor, multiple sets, moving with purpose. He barely had time to step back to his cleaning cart before the door opened and 3 people entered. A tall doctor in an immaculate white coat with a distinctive scar running across his left hand, a nurse Marcus recognized from the day shift who shouldn't be here at midnight, and a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the casual authority of someone who owned things, including probably this hospital. "What are you doing in here?" the doctor demanded, and Marcus kept his eyes down, submissive, forgettable. "Cleaning, sir. Night supervisor sent me for a spill," he said, and the suited man's eyes narrowed. "There's no spill, and this room is restricted access," he said, and Marcus could feel the temperature in the room drop, could sense the calculation happening, the decision being made about what to do with an unexpected witness. "My mistake, sir. Must have got the wrong room number," Marcus said, beginning to back toward the door. But the suited man held up a hand. "Wait," he said, studying Marcus with the kind of attention that made Marcus's skin prickle. "I know you. You're the night janitor, Webb, isn't it? Been here, what, 10 years? 11, sir," Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral, and the man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. 11 years of reliable service, never a complaint, never a problem. Always where you're supposed to be doing exactly what you're supposed to do," he said. And there was something in his tone that suggested he knew those words described a carefully maintained cover, not a life. "Just trying to do my job, sir," Marcus said, and the suited man, who Marcus now realized must be Jonathan Whitmore, though he'd only seen him in photographs, stepped closer. "Then do your job, Webb. Clean whatever needs cleaning and forget you were ever in this room. Understand?" The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of a man who'd made people disappear before, but before Marcus could respond, a weak voice came from the bed. "Webb? Marcus Webb." Richard Caldwell had opened his eyes, and despite the obvious pain and confusion clouding his features, something like recognition flickered there. "You look familiar. Have we met?" Marcus's heart hammered because this was the moment, the decision point, and he could feel Whitmore's eyes boring into him, could sense the nurse's hand moving toward her pocket where she undoubtedly carried a syringe of something that would make problems go away. "No, sir, just the janitor, sir," Marcus said, but Richard's eyes, even dulled by whatever poison was in his system, held something sharp. "No, I know that face. I never forget a face. Where do I know you from?" And now Whitmore was moving, stepping between Marcus and the bed. "Mr. Caldwell, you're confused from the medication. This is just maintenance staff," he said smoothly, but Richard tried to sit up, groaning with the effort. "Emma," he gasped. "Where's Emma? She was here." She was scared. And Marcus saw his chance, saw the opening. "Your daughter is fine, sir. I saw her earlier. She wanted to make sure you were okay," he said, and something in Richard's eyes sharpened further. "You talked to Emma? When?" he demanded, and Whitmore's face went very still. "That's enough," Whitmore said, his voice hard now, and he nodded to the nurse, who pulled out exactly what Marcus expected. A syringe preloaded with something that would probably stop whatever questions Richard Caldwell wanted to ask. Marcus had perhaps 3 seconds to make a choice that would end 23 years of carefully constructed invisibility. 3 seconds to decide if the terror in a little girl's eyes was worth everything he'd sacrificed to disappear. And as the nurse moved toward Richard's foreport, Marcus stepped forward and caught her wrist, not hard, not aggressive, just firm and unmovable, and he said in a voice that no longer belonged to a forgettable janitor, "I don't think that's part of his prescribed treatment." The room went silent and Marcus could feel everything changing. Feel the mask he'd worn for 11 years cracking apart because authority couldn't be faked, experience couldn't be hidden, and Whitmore's eyes went very wide. "Who the hell are you?" he said, and Marcus let go of the nurse's wrist, took a step back, his mind racing through options and consequences. "Someone who thinks you should call Mr. Caldwell's actual physician before administering any more medications," he said, and Richard, even through his confusion and pain, seemed to understand that something significant was happening. "Marcus Webb," he said again, and then suddenly, impossibly, his eyes went huge. "Jesus Christ, Marcus Webb, not the Marcus Webb, not the surgeon you died. They said you died in that explosion in—" But Whitmore cut him off, his voice sharp and commanding. "Security now," he said into a phone that had appeared in his hand, and the door burst open with armed guards, and Marcus knew he'd just destroyed everything, blown his cover completely, for a man he'd never met and a little girl who'd asked him to believe her. "This man is trespassing and making threats," Whitmore said, his composure returned, his voice smooth again. "Escort him from the building and I want him banned from these premises permanently." The guards moved forward, but Richard Caldwell, using what must have been enormous effort, pulled the oxygen mask from his face and said, "Stop," with enough force that everyone froze. "If this is Marcus Webb," he said, gasping between words, "the trauma surgeon who was declared dead in Afghanistan 23 years ago, the man who saved 200 lives at a field hospital before a supposed Taliban attack killed everyone there. If this is that Marcus Webb, then I want to know what the hell he's doing mopping my floors and why he thinks my treatment is wrong." The room held its breath and Marcus stood very still because this was it. This was the moment where everything he'd built collapsed, where the careful fiction dissolved, and he could either lie and maybe escape this with just a lost job, or he could tell the truth and accept whatever came after. "Because your 4-bag has been tampered with," Marcus said quietly. "The medication is correct but the concentration is wrong. The batch number indicates a compound that should never be given to someone with your specific genetic markers, information that would only be available to someone who had access to your complete medical file and understood advanced pharmacogenomics. And if you continue receiving it for another 48 hours, your organs will shut down in a way that will look exactly like your cancer progressing, and no one will ask questions because terminal pancreatic cancer patients die. That's what they do. Except you're not supposed to die for another 6 months at least, which means someone has decided to accelerate your timeline." The silence that followed was absolute, and Marcus could see Whitmore's face go through several expressions: shock, calculation, and then something cold and final. "That's an insane accusation," he said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. "Security, remove this man immediately." "Wait," Richard said again, and despite his weakness, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd built an empire. "Webb, if you're really who you say you are, you'd know that my genetic markers are classified information, available only to my personal physician and the research team, so either you're guessing or you have access to information you shouldn't have." Marcus could feel the trap closing, could see Whitmore's confidence returning, because how would a janitor know these things? But then Emma's voice echoed in his memory, and he made his third choice of the night, the one that would change everything. "Your daughter has the same markers," he said. "And 3 years ago she had an allergic reaction to a medication at her school, a reaction that was noted in the emergency room file, a file that cross-referenced back to your medical records because You're listed as her father and medical guardian, and that information was improperly stored in a database that anyone with mid-level hospital access could find if they knew what to look for, which I do because before I was a janitor I was a trauma surgeon with a specialty in combat medicine and chemical exposure, and after the explosion that was supposed to kill me, I spent 2 years in witness protection because I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, something involving pharmaceutical companies testing compounds on soldiers without proper consent, something that powerful people wanted buried along with everyone who knew about it. The room went very, very quiet, and Richard Caldwell's face showed something like understanding, while Whitmore's expression was now completely unreadable, a mask over whatever calculations were happening behind his eyes. That's a hell of a story, Richard said. But even if it's true, even if you're really Dr. Marcus Webb who supposedly died in that explosion, why should I believe you about my treatment? You could be paranoid, damaged, wrong. Marcus reached into his pocket and immediately 3 security guards drew weapons, but he moved slowly, deliberately, pulling out his phone and holding it up so Richard could see the screen. Because 20 minutes ago I took a photo of your 4 bag, he said. And the batch number on that bag matches a compound that was flagged by the FDA 6 months ago for causing exactly the kind of organ failure you're experiencing, a flag that was mysteriously withdrawn after your company, Caldwell Pharmaceuticals, provided additional testing data, and I'm betting if we compare the timing of that withdrawal to certain financial transactions, we'll find something very interesting. Whitmore moved then, fast for a man in an expensive suit, lunging for Marcus's phone, but Marcus had spent 23 years preparing for moments like this, and he stepped aside easily, letting Whitmore stumble past him, and in that moment of chaos Marcus reached over and simply pulled Richard's 4-line, disconnecting it from the port in his arm, and the monitors immediately began alarming, bringing nurses running from the corridor. What the hell is happening in here? A new voice demanded, and Dr. Sarah Chan, the head of Pinnacle Medical Center, pushed through the gathering crowd, her face showing alarm and confusion. This man just assaulted a patient, Whitmore said immediately, but Richard held up a hand, his voice weak but clear. Dr. Chan, I want this 4-bag tested immediately, complete analysis, I want to know exactly what's in it and whether the concentration matches my prescription, he said, and then he looked at Marcus. And I want this man protected, whatever security detail you have, I want him under guard until we sort this out. Dr. Chan looked between them, clearly trying to understand what was happening, and Whitmore's expression went from cold to desperate. Richard, you're not thinking clearly, the medication is making you paranoid. This is exactly what Dr. Harrison warned us might happen with this particular treatment protocol, he said, and Marcus noticed the way he emphasized might happen, as if that explanation had been prepared in advance, ready for this exact moment. Then the test will prove I'm wrong, Richard said, his eyes never leaving Whitmore's face. And if I'm wrong, I'll apologize to everyone and increase your bonus, but if I'm right, Jonathan, if someone has been poisoning me, then we're going to have a very different conversation. Something flickered across Whitmore's face, something that looked almost like sadness, and he said quietly, Richard, we've been partners for 30 years, friends for longer, you really think I'd hurt you? And there was something in his voice that made Marcus's instinct scream, because that tone was practiced, rehearsed, the sound of a man who'd prepared for this contingency. I don't know what I think anymore, Richard said, and he looked suddenly very old and very tired. But my daughter was terrified tonight, scared enough to run to a janitor for help, and I need to know why. Dr. Chan, to her credit, made a decision. Security, I want this 4-bag logged and sent to our independent lab immediately, full analysis, results to come directly to me and Mr. Caldwell's personal physician. No one else touches it or sees the results until we have answers, she said, and then she looked at Marcus. And you, whoever you are, you're confined to the building until we sort this out. I'm putting you in a private room under observation. That's not necessary, Whitmore started, but Dr. Chan cut him off. Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect to your position on the board, this is a medical facility, and when a patient expresses concerns about their treatment, we take them seriously, she said, and Marcus could see the woman's mind working, seeing the implications, understanding that something very wrong might be happening in her hospital. The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Marcus was taken to a small private room on the 4th floor, with a security guard outside his door who looked very confused about whether he was protecting Marcus or imprisoning him. Richard Caldwell was moved to a different suite with new 4 lines and round-the-clock nursing supervision. Emma was reunited with her father under the watchful eyes of Child Protective Services, called by someone who wanted to ensure the girl's testimony was properly documented. And somewhere in the building's basement laboratory, technicians were running tests on a clear fluid that would either prove Marcus was a paranoid janitor with delusions of medical expertise, or would reveal something that would shake Caldwell Pharmaceuticals to its foundation. Marcus sat in his room, still wearing his janitor's uniform, and tried not to think about the phone call he'd have to make, the people he'd have to notify that his cover was blown, the life he'd built for 23 years that was now destroyed because a little girl had trusted him, and somewhere around 4 a.m., as the city outside his window began its slow transition from night to dawn, his door opened and a woman entered, someone he'd never seen before, wearing a dark suit and an expression that told him everything he needed to know about who she worked for. "Dr. Webb," she said, using his real name for the first time in over 2 decades, "we need to talk about what happens next." Marcus looked at her and felt a strange sense of calm, because the decision was made, the die was cast, and whatever came next would at least be honest. "Tell me about the test results first," he said, and the woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, something like respect. "The 4-bag contained exactly what you said it did, the correct medication but at 3 times the prescribed concentration, mixed with a compound that would accelerate liver failure while mimicking natural disease progression," she said. "Richard Caldwell would have been dead within 72 hours, and the autopsy would have shown nothing unusual, just a very sick man succumbing to his illness." Marcus nodded slowly because he'd had seen enough chemical poisonings in his previous life to recognize the signs, but hearing it confirmed made it real, made it undeniable. "And Whitmore?" he asked. "Jonathan Whitmore left the building approximately 3 hours ago," the woman said. "We have people looking for him, but he had a significant head start, and men like him have contingency plans." "This was about the company," Marcus said, "not a question but a statement. Richard was dying anyway. So why rush it unless there was something time-sensitive, something that needed to happen before he could change his will or alter the company structure?" The woman sat down across from him, and Marcus saw the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of how much to tell him. "Caldwell Pharmaceuticals was 3 weeks away from a major announcement," she said. "A new treatment protocol for pancreatic cancer, ironically, one that Richard had been pushing for years, but Whitmore and certain members of the board wanted to take the company in a different direction, wanted to prioritize more profitable drugs over Richard's pet projects, and as long as Richard was alive, he controlled 51% of voting shares, but his will splits that control among several trustees including Whitmore, and with Richard dead, the board could block the announcement, could redirect company resources, could essentially erase 5 years of research that Richard believed would save thousands of lives. Marcus absorbed this, seeing the shape of it now, understanding the cold mathematics that had turned a 30-year partnership into murder. "How much money are we talking about?" he asked. "The treatment Richard wanted to announce would cost approximately $800 per patient for a complete protocol," the woman said. "The alternative drugs that Whitmore's faction wants to push would cost between $50,000 and $80,000 per patient with comparable survival rates, so you do the math on profit margins, and then remember that there are approximately 60,000 new pancreatic cancer diagnoses in the U.S. every year." Marcus felt sick because he'd seen this before, had watched military contractors make similar calculations about soldier lives versus equipment costs, had testified about it to people who'd promised him protection and then arranged for him to die in an explosion that killed everyone who could corroborate his story, except he hadn't died, had survived through luck and the intervention of people who understood that some truths needed to be preserved even if they had to be buried for decades. "So what now?" he asked, and the woman leaned forward. "Now we have a problem," she said. "Because your cover is completely blown, your face is going to be all over this story once it breaks, and there are people, not just Whitmore but others, powerful people who thought you were safely dead, who are going to be very unhappy that you've resurfaced." "I can disappear again," Marcus said, but even as he said it, he knew it was too late, knew that you couldn't put this particular genie back in the bottle. "You could," the woman agreed, "but Richard Caldwell wants to hire you, wants you to run his medical research division, wants you to oversee the treatment announcement and ensure it actually reaches patients, and more importantly, his daughter Emma has been asking for you every hour, wants to know if you're okay, wants to make sure the bad men didn't hurt you, and that little girl saved her father's life by trusting you. So the question isn't whether you can disappear, Dr. Webb, the question is whether you want to." Marcus thought about 11 years of mopping floors, of being invisible, of carefully constructed anonymity, and then he thought about a little girl running barefoot down a hospital corridor, terrified and desperate, choosing to trust a janitor because he was the only person who'd looked at her like she mattered, and he made his final choice of that long night. "I want to see Emma first," he said. "I want to make sure she understands that she did the right thing, that she was brave and smart, and everything a kid should be, and then I want to hear what Caldwell is proposing, and then we'll figure out what happens next." The woman smiled, genuinely this time, and stood up. "He thought you'd say that," she said. "Come on, he's waiting in his new suite, and fair warning, Emma has not stopped talking about Mr. Marcus for the past 4 hours, so prepare yourself." They walked through the hospital corridors, and Marcus was struck by how different everything looked in the morning light, how the sterile whites and grays softened into something almost warm, and when they reached Richard Caldwell's new suite, he found a scene that was entirely unexpected. Richard was sitting up in bed, looking weak but clear-eyed and alert, with Emma curled against his side reading him a story from a picture book, and when she saw Marcus, her whole face lit up with a joy so pure it made his chest ache. "Mr. Marcus!" she cried, scrambling off the bed and running to him. "Daddy says you saved his life, that you're a real doctor and you saw the bad medicine and you stopped it, and I told him I knew you were special, I could tell." Marcus crouched down to her level, the way he had in the hallway last night when the world was simpler, and he said gently, "You're the one who saved him, Emma. You were brave enough to ask for help, and that's the hardest thing in the world. But you believed me," she said, her eyes serious beyond her years. "Everyone always says kids are making things up or imagining things, but you believed me right away." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built 23 years ago to protect himself from caring too much, from letting people in, and he said, "I believed you because you were telling the truth, and the truth is always worth listening to, no matter who speaks it." Emma hugged him then, fierce and strong, and over her head Marcus met Richard Caldwell's eyes, and the billionaire nodded slowly, a gesture of understanding and respect and something deeper, a recognition between two men who'd both survived things that should have killed them and come out the other side changed. "Dr. Webb," Richard said formally. "Or should I call you Marcus?" "Marcus is fine," he said, gently extracting himself from Emma's embrace. "Though I have to tell you, I haven't practiced medicine in 23 years, I'm probably not qualified for whatever you're thinking. You diagnosed my poisoning from a glance at an 4 bag and saved my life," Richard said dryly. "I think your qualifications are sufficient, but that's not actually what I want to talk to you about." He gestured for Marcus to sit, and when Emma climbed back onto the bed, Richard wrapped an arm around her protectively, and Marcus saw the fierce love there, the determination of a father who'd come too close to losing everything that mattered. "I want to know why you disappeared," Richard said. "I want to know what you saw in Afghanistan that was worth dying for, and I want to know if it has anything to do with my company." Marcus looked at this man, this powerful, wealthy, influential figure who could crush him with a phone call or save him with the same, and he made a decision to trust again, to believe that maybe not everyone in power was corrupt, that maybe some fights were worth fighting even when they seemed impossible. 17 years ago, Caldwell Pharmaceuticals had a subsidiary called MedTech Solutions, Marcus began. They had a contract with the Department of Defense to develop combat performance enhancers, medications that would keep soldiers alert, focused, and effective for extended periods without sleep, and they tested them on troops without proper informed consent, without adequate safety protocols, and when soldiers started dying, not dramatically, not obviously, but slowly, from organ failure and neurological damage. That looked like combat stress. They buried the reports and labeled the dead as casualties of war. Richard's face went very pale, and Marcus continued, "I was the trauma surgeon at a field hospital in Kandahar, and I noticed a pattern, soldiers from specific units presenting with symptoms that didn't match their injuries, and when I started asking questions, when I started documenting cases and preparing to file a report, someone decided that the entire hospital needed to disappear, that everyone who might have seen the pattern needed to be eliminated, and they arranged for a Taliban attack. That killed 37 people, doctors, nurses, patients, everyone, except the attack wasn't Taliban. It was a drone strike authorized by people who had the power to make records disappear and make sure the only story that survived was the one they wanted told." The room was silent except for the beeping of monitors, and Emma was staring at Marcus with wide eyes, not understanding all the words but sensing the weight of them, and Richard's jaw was tight with something that might have been rage or might have been grief. MedTech Solutions, he said quietly. I shut down that subsidiary 12 years ago, after I received an anonymous tip about improper testing protocols, and I thought I'd cleaned house, thought I'd gotten rid of the people responsible, but if what you're saying is true, then I didn't go far enough, didn't look deep enough. Whitmore was on the board of MedTech Solutions, Marcus said, not a question, and Richard nodded slowly. He was, he confirmed. And he fought me when I wanted to shut it down, argued that we were abandoning a lucrative contract, but I overruled him and I thought that was the end of it. Marcus felt pieces clicking together, patterns emerging from chaos the way they always did when you looked at systems instead of individuals, and he said carefully, what if it wasn't about the specific contract? What if Whitmore and others saw what happened, saw how easy it was to make problems disappear when you had enough power and enough money, and decided that approach was applicable to other situations, other inconvenient truths? Richard's eyes went very sharp, very focused, and Marcus could see the businessman calculating, running scenarios, seeing implications. You're suggesting that my attempted murder isn't an isolated incident, he said. You're suggesting there's a pattern of eliminating obstacles to profit, of treating human lives as acceptable losses in service of corporate goals. I'm suggesting that men like Whitmore don't suddenly develop a conscience, Marcus said. And if he was willing to kill you, his partner of 30 years, over a disagreement about drug pricing and research priorities, then he's probably done it before, probably has a system in place, probably has connections to people who specialize in making problems disappear quietly and legally. Emma spoke up then, her voice small but clear. Like the lady with the needle? She asked, and both men turned to look at her. What lady, sweetheart? Richard asked gently. The nurse who kept giving you medicine even when you said you didn't want it, Emma said. She was here a lot, more than the other nurses, and she always made sure I was in the other room or sleeping when she came, but I saw her a few times and she had cold eyes like she didn't care if you hurt. Marcus and Richard exchanged glances and Marcus said, Do you remember what she looked like, Emma? Could you describe her? Emma nodded seriously, as if understanding that this was important, and she described a woman in her 40s with red hair pulled back in a tight bun, a small scar on her right cheek, and hands that moved very precisely, very carefully, like someone who was used to doing delicate work, and Marcus felt ice slide down his spine because he knew that description, had seen that woman in the cafeteria dozens of times over the past 11 years, had noticed her because she never quite fit the pattern of regular nursing staff, always seemed to be assigned to special cases, high-profile patients, complicated situations. Her name tag said Sharon Collins, Emma added. But one time I heard another nurse call her something different, something like Stevens or Stewart, and she got really mad and told the nurse to be more careful. Richard's hand found his phone and he made a call, his voice low and urgent, and Marcus heard him instructing someone to pull all personnel files for nursing staff, to search for Sharon Collins and any variations, to flag anyone with multiple name variants or employment gaps that didn't quite add up, and then he ended the call and looked at Marcus with something like desperation. How deep does this go? He asked. If there's someone on staff whose job is to eliminate patients quietly, if Whitmore has been running some kind of systematic operation to remove obstacles, then how many others are involved? How many people at my company have been complicit? That's what we need to find out, Marcus said. And we need to do it carefully, because if Whitmore knew you suspected something, if he had time to prepare, then he's probably already activating contingencies, covering tracks, eliminating evidence. As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed, the ancient flip phone he'd pulled from his locker, the one with exactly one number programmed, the number he'd texted when Emma first came running to him, and when he looked at the message, his blood ran cold. Whitmore has resources we didn't know about, 3 attempts on secure witnesses in the past hour, recommend immediate extraction of principal and family, respond to confirm. Marcus showed the message to Richard, watching the billionaire's face cycle through shock and anger and something harder, something determined, and when Richard spoke his voice was steel. They're coming for us, he said, not a question, and Marcus nodded. They're coming for all of us, he confirmed, and then he looked at Emma, at this little girl who'd already been through too much, who deserved a childhood that wasn't filled with fear and violence, and he made yet another decision. We need to move now, get Emma somewhere safe, somewhere they can't reach her, and then we figure out how to fight back. Richard was already moving, despite his weakness, despite the fact that he'd been poisoned hours ago and should probably be unconscious, and Marcus saw the father overriding the patient, saw the fierce protective instinct that wealth and power couldn't manufacture, The thing that made him human beneath all the billions. I have a safe house, Richard said. Upstate. No one knows about it except my head of personal security. A place I bought under Shell Corporation specifically for situations like this. But we need to get out of this hospital without anyone knowing where we're going. Marcus thought fast, running scenarios, calculating risks, and he said, the hospital has 3 exits that security doesn't monitor constantly. The loading dock on the east side, the morgue exit in the basement, and the mechanical room that connects to the parking structure. But all of them require key cards and all of them have cameras, so whoever is watching, and you better believe someone is watching, will see us the moment we move. Then we don't use the exits, a new voice said from the doorway. And Dr. Sarah Chan entered the room with an expression that suggested she'd made her own calculations and come to her own conclusions. We use the tunnels. Marcus stared at her, because he'd worked at this hospital for 11 years and never knew there were tunnels. But Richard was nodding slowly, recognition dawning on his face. The old system, he said. From when this was 3 separate buildings before the renovation, they connected everything underground for supply transport. But I thought those were sealed off years ago. Most of them are, Dr. Chan said. But there's still one route that's maintained for emergency use, runs from the subbasement to a building 3 blocks away. Technically it's for hazmat situations or if we need to evacuate patients without using the streets, and very few people know it exists. Marcus looked between them, seeing an alliance forming, seeing a woman who dedicated her life to healing deciding that her hospital had been corrupted and choosing to do something about it. And he asked the critical question. Why are you helping us? If Whitmore has people inside this building, if there's a network protecting him, then you're putting yourself at enormous risk. Dr. Chen's face hardened, and Marcus saw something there. Some old wound reopened. Because 6 months ago, a patient died in my hospital under circumstances that never quite made sense, she said. A state senator who was about to introduce legislation regulating pharmaceutical pricing, who checked in for a routine procedure and suffered catastrophic complications that multiple specialists couldn't explain, and the autopsy showed nothing conclusive, just a tragic medical event, the kind of thing that happens sometimes despite everyone's best efforts, except it's been eating at me the feeling that I missed something, that someone died in my care and I didn't ask enough questions. The room went quiet, and Marcus felt the shape of it expanding, felt the scope of what they were uncovering grow from a single attempted murder to something systemic, something that had been happening for years right under everyone's noses. How many others? Richard asked quietly, his voice rough. How many people have died in this hospital because they were inconvenient to someone powerful? Dr. Chan shook her head. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. After we get you and your daughter somewhere safe, I'm going to pull every death certificate, every unexpected complication, every tragic medical event from the past 5 years, and I'm going to find the pattern because if you're right, if there's a nurse on staff who specializes in quiet elimination, then there will be a pattern, there has to be. Marcus nodded because she was right because systems always left traces and he said, we need to move now. The longer we wait, the more time they have to set up to position people to close off options. Dr. Chun pulled out a key card from her pocket, a special one marked with a red stripe that Marcus had never seen before. This gives access to the tunnel system, she said. I'm going to create a diversion, a medical emergency on the 2nd floor that will pull security attention away from the subbasement, and you'll have approximately 15 minutes to get through the tunnels before someone realizes the emergency was staged. What kind of diversion? Marcus asked, and Dr. Chan smiled grimly. The kind that involves a fire alarm, a malfunctioning oxygen line, and enough chaos to make everyone forget to watch their cameras, she said. Give me 10 minutes to get into position, then head to subbasement access point 3. It's marked on the service elevator that only goes down from the 1st floor. You'll need this card to activate it. She handed the key card to Marcus, and Richard was already moving, getting Emma dressed in clothes that someone had brought from their estate, speaking to her softly, preparing her for what came next. And Marcus watched this billionaire who should be lying in bed recovering from poisoning instead choose his daughter's safety over his own health. And something in Marcus's carefully constructed emotional walls cracked a little further. Emma, Richard said gently, we're going to play a game now, a very important game where we have to be very quiet and very brave. And Mr. Marcus is going to help us, okay? The little girl nodded, her eyes wide but trusting, and she reached out to take Marcus's hand with one of hers while holding her father's with the other. And Marcus felt the weight of that trust settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. 10 minutes later, they were in the service elevator, and Marcus could hear alarms starting to sound somewhere above them, could hear the organized chaos of a hospital responding to an emergency, and the elevator descended past the regular basement, past the mechanical levels, down to a sub-basement that wasn't marked on any public floor plans, and when the doors opened, they faced a concrete tunnel that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. All raw walls and exposed pipes and lighting that flickered uncertainly. "Stay close," Marcus said, leading them into the tunnel, and behind them the elevator doors closed with a finality that felt like burning bridges, like crossing points of no return, and they moved through the underground darkness with only the sporadic lighting to guide them, Emma between them, silent and brave and trusting in a way that made Marcus's heart ache. They'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when Marcus heard it. Footsteps behind them, multiple sets, moving fast, and he knew immediately that someone had figured out their route, had somehow anticipated the tunnel, and he had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision. "Run," he said quietly to Richard. "Straight ahead, don't stop until you reach the exit. There should be stairs leading up to a building 3 blocks north. Get Emma out and get to your safe house." "What about you?" Richard asked, but he was already moving, already prioritizing his daughter's safety over questions. "I'm going to buy you time," Marcus said, and then he did something he hadn't done in 23 years. He stopped running, stopped hiding, and turned to face the people chasing him, because some things mattered more than survival, and a little girl's safety was one of them. The footsteps resolved into 3 men, all dressed in hospital security uniforms but moving with the precision and coordination of people with tactical training, and Marcus recognized the type immediately. Military contractors, private security, the kind of people who did jobs that couldn't appear on any official records, and the lead man raised a weapon, a pistol with a suppressor, the kind that would make a sound quiet enough not to echo through concrete tunnels. "Dr. Webb," the man said, his voice professionally neutral, "you need to come with us. Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you." Marcus stood very still, calculating angles and distances, and he said, "Whitmore wants me dead, so let's skip the pretense." The man's expression didn't change. "Dead, alive, Mr. Whitmore is in particular, but he would prefer to ask you some questions first, like how many people you've told about Afghanistan, who you've been in contact with, what evidence you might have stored somewhere, those sorts of things." "And if I don't feel like answering questions?" Marcus asked, and the man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that predators use before they strike. "Then we find the little girl and her father and convince them to persuade you," he said, and Marcus felt rage flash through him, cold and focused, the kind that had gotten him through field hospitals and combat zones and situations where the wrong decision meant people died. "You're not touching that child," Marcus said, and something in his voice made the lead man's smile fade, made him reassess, made him realize that maybe this 62-year-old former janitor was more dangerous than he appeared. "Then we have a problem," the man said, and he raised his weapon and Marcus moved, using training that hadn't atrophied despite 2 decades of disuse, closing the distance before the man could properly aim, getting inside his reach, driving an elbow into the man's throat with enough force to crush his windpipe, and the weapon clattered to the concrete as the man collapsed, gasping and dying, and Marcus grabbed the gun and rolled, coming up with it trained on the other 2 men who were reaching for their own weapons. "Stop," Marcus commanded, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions under fire, someone who knew exactly how to end lives and wouldn't hesitate if necessary, and the 2 men froze, their hands hovering near their holsters. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded. "Specifically, who gave the order?" The 2 men exchanged glances, calculating, and Marcus knew they were trained not to give up information, trained to resist interrogation, but he also knew that training assumptions went out the window when someone had just killed your team leader with their bare hands in under 2 seconds. "A woman," one of them finally said. "Calls herself the coordinator. We don't know her real name. She contracts through encrypted channels, pays in cryptocurrency, provides targets and objectives. We never meet face to face." Marcus felt pieces clicking together, understanding that this was bigger than Whitmore, bigger than one corrupt pharmaceutical executive. This was an infrastructure, a service that powerful people could use when they needed problems eliminated. "How many jobs has she given you?" he asked. "This is our 4th with her," the same man said. 3 before this, all medical settings, all targets who were patients or family members, all made to look like natural complications or tragic accidents. "Names," Marcus demanded. "Give me the names of your previous targets." The man hesitated, and Marcus adjusted his aim slightly. Not threatening but making it clear he was willing to follow through. Senator James Morrison, the man said. 6 months ago, heart complications during routine surgery. Rebecca Chan, a journalist, 4 months ago, allergic reaction to medication. And Dr. David Park, a research scientist, 2 months ago, hospital-acquired infection that became septic. Marcus memorized the names, filing them away, and he was about to ask more questions when he heard something that made his blood freeze. A child's scream, distant but unmistakable, Emma's voice cutting through the concrete tunnels with terror, and Marcus made an instant decision, because he couldn't interrogate these men and go help Emma, couldn't do both, and the child mattered more than information. He moved fast, using the pistol grip to strike the first man's temple, dropping him unconscious, then doing the same to the second before they could react, and then he was running toward that scream, his heart hammering because he'd sent Richard and Emma ahead thinking they'd be safe, thinking the pursuit was behind them, but he'd miscalculated, hadn't considered that this coordinator might have people positioned ahead as well as behind, and that mistake might cost a child her life. He found them at the tunnel exit, where concrete stairs led up to a metal door, and the scene froze him for a split second. Richard was on the ground, blood streaming from his head where someone had hit him, barely conscious, and Emma was being held by a woman in nurse's scrubs, Sharon Collins, the woman with the cold eyes, who had one hand clamped over Emma's mouth and the other holding a syringe near the child's neck, and standing behind them was Jonathan Whitmore himself, looking weary and sad, and utterly certain of his righteousness. "Marcus," Whitmore said, using his first name like they were old friends, "you've caused quite a lot of trouble tonight, more than I expected from a janitor, but I suppose you were never really a janitor, were you?" Marcus kept the pistol trained on Whitmore, but his eyes were on Emma, on the terror in her face, on the way she was trying not to cry, trying to be brave. "Let the girl go," Marcus said. "Your problem is with me and Richard, leave her out of it." Whitmore shook his head sadly. "I wish I could, truly I do, but she's seen too much, heard too much, and more importantly she's leverage, the thing that will make both of you cooperate with what happens next." "Which is what?" Marcus asked, buying time, his mind racing through scenarios, calculating chances of making a shot that would drop Sharon without the syringe plunging into Emma's neck. "You're going to walk away," Whitmore said simply. "You're going to use whatever connections you still have from your previous life, whatever witness protection arrangement you had before, and you're going to disappear again, completely, permanently, and in exchange Emma lives, Richard lives, and this all ends quietly." Marcus stared at him, seeing the calculation there, the businessman's approach to problem solving, eliminate variables, minimize risk, cut losses. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then Sharon gives Emma what's in that syringe, a concentrated dose of the same compound we were using on Richard, fast-acting, organ failure within hours, tragic accident, poor child never recovered from the stress of seeing her father so ill. And then we have a much messier situation to clean up, one that involves witnesses and police and complications that none of us want." Marcus felt his finger tighten on the trigger, felt the cold calculation of combat medicine taking over, weighing outcomes, measuring acceptable losses, and then Emma's eyes found his, and there was no fear there, just trust, just absolute certainty that Mr. Marcus would save her, and something in Marcus broke, some last wall he'd built around his heart to keep himself safe, to keep himself detached, and he knew he couldn't make the cold calculation, couldn't accept any outcome that risked this. "Child. Okay," he said quietly, lowering the weapon. "Okay, you win, I'll disappear, just let her go." Whitmore's face showed relief, genuine emotion breaking through his businessman's mask, and he nodded to Sharon, who loosened her grip on Emma slightly, and in that moment of transition, when Sharon's attention was split between restraint and release, when Whitmore believed he'd won and dropped his guard just slightly, Richard Caldwell moved, and despite his injuries, despite the blood streaming down his face, despite being poisoned and beaten and left for dead, he surged up from the ground and threw himself at Sharon's legs, tackling her, and Emma twisted free as they went down, and Marcus moved, crossing the distance in 3 strides, his body remembering training that had saved hundreds of lives in field hospitals, that had made him legendary for staying calm under fire, and he grabbed Emma and kept moving, carrying her past Whitmore who reached for them too slowly, carrying her up the concrete stairs toward the metal door and freedom beyond. Behind him he heard Sharon scream something, heard Whitmore shouting, heard Richard's grunt of pain, but Marcus didn't stop, couldn't stop, because his job now was singular. Save this child, and he burst through the metal door into early morning sunlight, into an alley behind what looked like an abandoned office building, and he kept running, Emma's arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder, and he ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, ran until he reached a street corner where early morning traffic was starting, where there were witnesses and cameras and the safety of public attention. Only then did he stop, setting Emma down carefully, checking her for injuries, for any sign that the syringe had connected, but she was unharmed, just terrified and crying, and Marcus pulled her close and held her while she sobbed, while the fear finally came out, while the brave facade crumbled into the very reasonable tears of a child who'd been through hell. "Your daddy," Emma gasped between sobs. "We have to help my daddy, they're going to hurt him." Marcus's heart clenched because she was right, because Richard had sacrificed himself to buy them escape, had thrown himself into danger so his daughter could run, and Marcus had left him there, had made the choice to save Emma first, and now Richard was alone with people who wanted him dead, and Marcus had to decide. Keep Emma safe or go back for her father, and he couldn't do both. He pulled out his phone, the regular one, not the encrypted flip phone, and he dialed 911, and when the operator answered he said very clearly, "This is Dr. Marcus Webb, I'm at the corner of 5th and Madison with Emma Caldwell, age 8, daughter of Richard Caldwell, who is being held against his will in a tunnel system beneath Pinnacle Medical Center by armed men. We need police, ambulances, and this needs to be recorded because there's going to be an attempt to cover this up." The operator started asking questions, but Marcus just kept talking, kept stating facts, kept creating an official record that couldn't be easily erased. "The men holding Richard Caldwell are working for Jonathan Whitmore, CEO of Caldwell Pharmaceuticals, who has been systematically murdering people who threaten corporate profits, including Richard Caldwell himself, who was being poisoned in his hospital room. I have evidence, I have witnesses, and I need someone here now before they kill Richard and make it look like an accident." He could hear the operator's uncertainty, her protocol trying to catch up with information that didn't fit normal emergency call patterns, but he also heard her typing, heard her dispatching units, heard the machinery of official response grinding into motion, and he knew that once that machinery started, it was harder to stop, harder to bury, harder to make disappear quietly. While he waited, still holding Emma, who'd stopped crying and was listening intently, Marcus made 2 more calls. The first to Dr. Sarah Chun, warning her that the situation had escalated and that she needed to secure any evidence she'd gathered about suspicious deaths at the hospital, and the second to the number on his encrypted phone, the one that connected him to people who'd helped him disappear 23 years ago, and when a voice answered, gruff, male, familiar even after all these years, Marcus said simply, "It's time, I need everything we had ready to go public, every piece of evidence from Afghanistan, every name of everyone involved, and I need it sent to every news organization simultaneously, because I'm about to expose something that connects to the original cover-up, and we need leverage, we need insurance, we need the truth out there before they can bury it again." There was a long pause, and then, "You understand what you're asking? This ends everything, every protection, every carefully constructed barrier between you and the people who tried to kill you." "I understand," Marcus said, "but there's a little girl here who trusts me, and her father is about to die if we don't act, and I'm done hiding, done letting innocent people suffer because I was too afraid to fight back." Another pause, and then, "Okay, give me 2 hours, everything will be everywhere, every email, every document, every piece of evidence we collected. It'll be impossible to suppress." Marcus ended the call just as police cars came screaming around the corner, lights flashing, and officers poured out with weapons drawn, and Marcus very carefully set down the pistol he'd taken from the tunnel, raised his hands and said clearly, "I'm Dr. Marcus Webb, this is Emma Caldwell, we are the victims here, and her father Richard Caldwell is still being held in the tunnels beneath Pinnacle Medical Center by armed men working for Jonathan Whitmore. You need to send SWAT immediately, because they're going to kill him if you don't." The next hours were a chaos of activity. Police securing the scene, paramedics checking Emma despite Marcus's insistence that she was physically unharmed, tactical teams descending on Pinnacle Medical Center with warrants and questions, and through it all Marcus stayed with Emma, refusing to be separated from her, holding her hand while she gave statements to gentle-voiced detectives who specialized in child witnesses, and when someone tried to take her to social services pending location of other family, Marcus said firmly, "Her father tasked me with protecting her, and until I see Richard Caldwell alive and conscious and able to make his own decisions about his daughter's care, she stays with me." The officers looked at each other uncertainly, Because protocol said one thing but the situation was extraordinary, and finally a senior detective said, "Fine, but you both stay here in protective custody until we sort this out." They were taken to a private room in a police station, guarded by officers who looked nervous about the weight of what they were protecting, and Emma curled up on a couch with her head in Marcus's lap, and he stroked her hair gently while she finally fell asleep, exhausted beyond measure, and Marcus sat there in the quiet and wondered if Richard Caldwell was still alive, if the police had reached him in time, if this entire nightmare would end with a little girl becoming an orphan. Because Marcus had made the wrong choices. Around noon, Dr. Sarah Chun appeared, escorted by detectives, her face drawn but determined, and she sat across from Marcus and said quietly, "They found Richard, he's alive, beaten badly but alive. Whitmore and Sharon Collins were gone. They must have fled when they heard the sirens, but we found evidence, Marcus, so much evidence." Marcus felt relief wash through him, felt some of the crushing weight lift from his shoulders, and he asked, "What kind of evidence?" Dr. Chun pulled out a tablet showing him files she'd compiled, and Marcus saw it. A pattern spanning 5 years, 17 deaths total, all patients at Pinnacle Medical Center, all inconvenient to powerful interests, all attended by Sharon Collins at some point during their final days, all dying from complications that were tragic but explainable. And when you looked at them individually, they were just bad luck. But when you saw them together, when you understood the pattern, it was undeniable. Senators, journalists, whistleblowers, business rivals, even a few family members of wealthy clients who stood to inherit fortunes. Dr. Chan said, her voice hollow. "My hospital was being used as a killing floor, and I never saw it, never questioned it, just accepted the deaths as part of medical practice." "It wasn't your fault," Marcus said. "These systems are designed to be invisible, designed to hide in the noise of normal operations. That's how they survive." "But how many people died because I didn't look closely enough?" she asked, and Marcus saw the guilt there, the weight of responsibility, and he understood it because he'd carried similar weight for 23 years. "Now you're looking," he said. "Now you're doing something about it, that's what matters." A detective entered the room then, young and serious-faced, and he said, "Dr. Webb, Richard Caldwell is asking for you. He's at New York Presbyterian Hospital under guard, and he specifically requested that you bring his daughter." Marcus looked down at Emma, still sleeping, still peaceful despite everything she'd been through, and he gently woke her, watched her eyes flutter open, watched recognition and relief flood her face when she saw him. "We're going to see your daddy," he said softly, and Emma sat up immediately, suddenly alert. "Is he okay?" she asked, and Marcus heard the fear there, the worry that she'd lost him despite everything. "He's going to be okay," Marcus said, praying it was true. "He asked for us, wants to see you." They were driven to New York Presbyterian in an unmarked police car, surrounded by a security detail that suggested someone was taking the threat seriously, and when they reached Richard's room, Marcus let Emma go in first, hanging back to give them privacy, watching through the observation window as the little girl ran to her father's bedside, as Richard pulled her into his arms despite what must have been considerable pain from his injuries, as they held each other and cried, and Marcus felt his own eyes burning because this was what he'd been fighting for, this moment of reunion, this proof that sometimes choosing to act instead of hide could save the things that mattered. After several minutes, Richard looked up and saw Marcus at the window, and he beckoned him in, and Marcus entered the room feeling suddenly self-conscious, suddenly aware that he was just a janitor who'd stumbled into something vast and complex, who'd made decisions that affected powerful people, who'd possibly destroyed his own life to save a man he barely knew and a child he'd met only hours ago. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice rough but strong, "Emma told me what you did, how you got her out, how you called for help, how you stayed with her." Marcus shrugged awkwardly. "Anyone would have done the same," he started, but Richard cut him off. "No," he said firmly. "No, most people would have run, would have prioritized their own safety, would have made rational calculations about acceptable losses, but you didn't. You chose us, chose to protect my daughter even when it meant giving up everything you'd built, and I need you to understand something. I am going to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never regret that choice." Marcus didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to respond to gratitude of that magnitude, so he just nodded, and Emma reached out from her father's arms and grabbed Marcus's hand, and they stood there for a moment, three people who'd been through hell together, who'd survived something that should have killed them, who'd become bound together by trauma and choice and the strange alchemy of crisis. Over the next days, the story exploded into public consciousness in ways that no one could have predicted. The evidence Marcus had triggered went live, thousands of documents flooding news organizations simultaneously, detailing not just the Afghanistan cover-up but its connections to ongoing pharmaceutical corruption, to systematic elimination of obstacles, to a network of contractors and facilitators and enablers that reached into corporations, hospitals, government offices, and law enforcement. Sharon Collins was found 3 days later, dead in what police initially called a suicide but which Marcus immediately recognized as another cleanup, someone eliminating a loose end. Jonathan Whitmore remained at large, but his face was everywhere, his name toxic, his empire crumbling as investors fled and prosecutors filed charges. And through it all, Marcus stayed close to Richard and Emma, protected by security that Richard hired, supported by legal teams that Richard funded, slowly adjusting to being visible again, to being Dr. Marcus Webb instead of a forgettable janitor. The first major twist came 2 weeks later, when a federal prosecutor approached Marcus with new information, her face grave as she showed him evidence that changed everything he thought he understood. "The coordinator," she said. "The woman who was contracting the killings, we've identified her, and you're not going to like who she is." Marcus looked at the file she handed him, saw the photograph, and felt his world tilt because the face staring back at him was familiar, was someone he'd known before Afghanistan, before the explosion, before everything went wrong. Colonel Patricia Morrison, his former commanding officer, the woman who'd sent him to that field hospital in Kandahar, who'd received his reports about soldier deaths, who'd promised to investigate, who'd been his mentor and friend, who he'd trusted completely, who'd supposedly died in the same explosion that was meant to kill him. "She's alive," Marcus said, his voice hollow, and the prosecutor nodded. "She never died," she confirmed. "She orchestrated the explosion, eliminated the witnesses, faked her own death, and then went underground to run this operation, using her military connections and medical knowledge to create a service that powerful people could use to eliminate problems. And when you resurfaced, when you broke your cover to save Richard Caldwell, she activated the resources meant to ensure you stayed dead." Marcus felt betrayed in ways he couldn't articulate, felt the foundations of his understanding crack, because if Patricia had been behind this all along, then everything he'd believed about Afghanistan was wrong, every assumption about who to trust was suspect, and he asked the question that burned. Why? Why would she do this? The prosecutor looked uncomfortable. Money. Initially, she was being paid enormous sums to facilitate the original cover-up, to ensure the drug testing stayed buried, but it evolved, became something bigger. She built an infrastructure, a network, turned it into a business, and apparently she's been running it for over 20 years, responsible for potentially hundreds of deaths. Marcus sat down heavily, trying to process this, trying to reconcile the woman he'd known, brilliant, dedicated, caring deeply about soldier welfare, with someone who'd spent 2 decades as an architect of systematic murder. "We need you to help us find her," the prosecutor said. "You knew her better than almost anyone, you understand how she thinks, and with Whitmore still missing, we believe they're together planning something." Marcus looked up at her. What could they possibly plan now? The evidence is public, the network is exposed, they can't unmake this. The prosecutor's expression was grim. "That's what worries us," she said. "Because people this desperate, this cornered, tend to do desperate things, and we have reason to believe they're planning something significant. Something that will either give them leverage for deals or will take down as many people as possible in revenge." Marcus spent the next week working with federal investigators, mapping out Patricia Morrison's known associates, her patterns of operation, her psychological profile, and every detail felt like a betrayal of memories he'd cherished, moments when she'd mentored him, encouraged him, pushed him to be a better surgeon and a better officer, and now he had to accept that all of it had been manipulation, grooming him to be useful until he became inconvenient, and then arranging for him to die when he saw too much. Richard was recovering steadily, his strength returning as the poison cleared from his system, and he transformed his hospital suite into a command center, making calls, issuing orders, using every resource at his disposal to hunt down Whitmore and dismantle the network that had tried to kill him. And Marcus watched this billionaire operate with the focused intensity of someone who'd built an empire from nothing, who understood that power was a tool that could be used for good or ill, depending on who wielded it. Emma was the center around which everything revolved, and both men made sure that despite the chaos, despite the danger, she felt safe and loved and protected, and Marcus found himself falling into a role he'd never expected. Surrogate family, the trusted friend who could make Emma laugh when nightmares woke her, who could explain complicated things in simple terms, who could just sit with her and read stories when words weren't needed, and Richard noticed, commented on it one evening when Emma had finally fallen asleep after a particularly difficult day. "She's attached to you," Richard said quietly, "calls you Uncle Marcus when she thinks you can't hear, draws pictures of the three of us together, asks if you'll stay even after everything is over." Marcus felt something catch in his throat. "I'm not sure where I'll go when this ends," he admitted. "My cover is blown, my old life is gone. I'm too visible now to just disappear again." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You could stay," he said. "Not as an employee, not as someone who owes me something, but as family because Emma needs you, and honestly I need you too, need someone who isn't impressed by money or intimidated by power, someone who makes decisions based on what's right instead of what's profitable." Before Marcus could respond, before he could process the enormity of what Richard was offering, alarms started sounding throughout the hospital floor, security protocols activating, and armed guards rushed into the room, weapons drawn, forming a protective perimeter around Richard's bed, and a voice came over the intercom, tense and professional. "Lockdown initiated, potential hostile breach, all personnel shelter in place." Marcus moved immediately to Emma, scooping her up from the couch where she'd been sleeping, holding her close as she woke confused and frightened, and Richard was already reaching for his phone, demanding answers from his security team, and what he heard made his face go pale. "They're in the building," he said. "Whitmore and Morrison, they bypassed security using credentials that shouldn't exist anymore. They're coming up, and they have explosives, enough to level this floor." Marcus felt ice in his veins because this was the desperate play, the endgame of people who'd lost everything and decided to take as many people down with them as possible, and he looked around the hospital suite, calculating exits and obstacles, realizing they were trapped on the 7th floor with limited options for escape. "The windows," Marcus said. "We can't go down through the hospital, but we can go across. There's a building next to this one. If we can break through to the maintenance catwalks, we might be able to reach it before they get here." Richard's security chief, a former Secret Service agent named Davis, was already moving, pulling equipment from hidden panels in the walls, because apparently Richard's paranoia had extended to preparing his hospital room for exactly this scenario, and Davis handed Marcus a harness and climbing rope, saying tersely, "You take Emma, I'll get Mr. Caldwell, we have maybe 3 minutes before they reach this floor." Marcus strapped Emma into the harness, connected it to his own, told her firmly, "Close your eyes, hold tight, don't look down and trust me." And Emma, brave beyond her years, just nodded and wrapped her arms around his neck, and Marcus didn't let himself think about the fact that he was about to climb out a 7th-story window with a child strapped to his chest, because thinking would mean hesitating and hesitating would mean death. Davis shattered the window with a specialized tool, and cold wind rushed in, and Marcus could see the maintenance catwalk about 15 feet away, a narrow metal structure that connected this building to the adjacent one, used by window washers and maintenance crews, and it looked impossibly far and impossibly fragile. But there was no time for doubt, so Marcus climbed out onto the window ledge, tested his grip on the rope Davis had secured to something structural inside the room, and then he jumped, swinging across open space with Emma's scream muffled against his shoulder, and his hands caught the catwalk railing and he pulled them up and over, landing hard on the metal grating, and Emma was crying but unhurt, and Marcus turned back to see Davis helping Richard out the window, the billionaire moving slower, still weak from poisoning and beatings, and behind them through the suite's open door, Marcus could see figures in tactical gear approaching, could see Whitmore's face, could see the cold determination there. Davis and Richard were halfway across when the explosion happened, not the massive blast that would have leveled the floor, but a smaller charge, precisely placed to destroy the rope's anchor point, and Marcus watched in horror as Davis and Richard dropped, their rope going slack, and Davis made a split-second choice, releasing his own harness and pushing Richard toward the catwalk, toward Marcus's reaching hands, and Richard flew across the gap while Davis fell 7 stories down to the street below, and Marcus caught Richard's wrist, held tight while Emma screamed and Richard hung in open air. His eyes locked on Marcus's, and Marcus pulled with every ounce of strength his 62-year-old body still possessed, pulled until Richard could grab the catwalk railing with his other hand, until they could drag him up and onto the metal structure, and below them Davis's body lay motionless on the pavement, surrounded by gathering crowds and approaching sirens. They ran then across the catwalk, through a maintenance access door that Davis had somehow unlocked remotely before he fell, into a service stairwell in the adjacent building, and they descended as fast as Richard's weakened state would allow, with Emma between them and the sound of pursuit echoing from above, and when they burst out onto the street level, they found a scene of absolute chaos. Police cars everywhere, SWAT teams establishing perimeters, news crews filming from behind barriers, and in the middle of it all, a black SUV with government plates, and standing beside it was the federal prosecutor who'd shown Marcus the evidence about Patricia Morrison, and she was waving them over urgently. They ran to the SUV, piled inside, and it pulled away immediately, racing through streets with a police escort, and the prosecutor looked at them, at the terrified child and the beaten billionaire and the former surgeon who'd become the unlikely hero of this story, and she said, "We got them, both of them. They were so focused on reaching you that they didn't notice our teams moving in behind them. They're in custody now, and this time there won't be any escaping, any faking deaths, any disappearing into networks because every camera in the world just watched them try to blow up a hospital floor." Marcus felt something release in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying for weeks, for years, for decades, and he looked at Emma, at Richard, at the two people who'd become his family through the crucible of shared trauma, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The trial became the media event of the decade, with every major network covering the proceedings, with testimony that exposed not just the pharmaceutical corruption and the systematic murders, but the deeper rot in systems that had allowed it to continue for so long, and Marcus testified for 3 days, walking the jury through Afghanistan, through the explosion, through 23 years of hiding, through the night Emma came running to him with terror in her eyes, and when he finished, when he'd laid bare every secret and every choice, the courtroom sat in stunned silence, and even the defense attorneys looked shaken by the scope of what had been revealed. Patricia Morrison took the stand in her own defense, and Marcus forced himself to watch, to hear her justify everything. The drug testing had been necessary for national security, the cover-up had been required to protect military readiness, the subsequent murders had been regrettable but unavoidable consequences of maintaining operational security, and she'd done it all in service of a greater good, sacrificing the few to protect the many. And as she spoke, Marcus saw how she'd rationalized it, how she'd convinced herself that the ends justified the means, how she'd transformed from a dedicated officer into a monster, while still believing she was serving a higher purpose. Jonathan Whitmore was more direct in his testimony. He'd wanted to save his company, to protect shareholder value, to ensure that Caldwell Pharmaceuticals remained profitable and competitive, and yes, Richard Caldwell had to die because his sentimental attachment to affordable treatments would have bankrupted them, would have destroyed everything they'd built, and sometimes business required hard choices, required eliminating competition and obstacles, and if that meant a few people died, well, that was just the cost of success in a capitalist system. The jury deliberated for 2 days, and when they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. And the sentencing hearing brought families of the 17 confirmed victims to testify about the lives stolen, about the holes left behind, about the years of wondering and grieving and never knowing that their loved ones had been murdered for the crime of being inconvenient. And when the judge finally pronounced sentence, life without parole for both Morrison and Whitmore, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just a quiet sadness that so many people had died before justice finally came. The aftermath stretched for months, with investigations expanding to uncover more of the network, with arrests of contractors and facilitators and enablers who participated in the murders, with reforms to hospital oversight and pharmaceutical testing and military medical protocols. And through it all, Marcus stayed with Richard and Emma, living in the penthouse of a Caldwell property in Manhattan, adjusting to being visible again, to being Dr. Marcus Webb, who saved lives instead of a janitor, who cleaned floors and slowly, carefully, rebuilding a life he'd thought was lost forever. Richard kept his promise, making Marcus the head of medical research at Caldwell Pharmaceuticals, but not as an employee, as a partner, restructuring the company's ownership so that Marcus had voting shares and decision-making authority, ensuring that the affordable treatment Richard had wanted to announce, the one that Whitmore tried to bury, would reach patients, and within 6 months of the trial ending, the new protocol was approved and distributed. And Marcus watched the survival rates climb, watched letters pour in from grateful families, and understood that this was what medicine was supposed to be. Emma thrived in ways that surprised everyone, resilient and strong and somehow not broken by everything she'd experienced. And Marcus learned that children could survive incredible trauma if they had love and safety and adults who believed them. And he made sure she had all three, attending her school plays and helping with homework and teaching her to think critically about the world. And one day, about a year after everything ended, she asked him the question he'd been expecting. "Uncle Marcus, are you going to stay forever?" And Marcus looked at this girl who'd saved her father by trusting a janitor, who'd been brave when adults would have crumbled, who'd become the daughter he'd never had, and he said simply, "Yes, if you and your dad will have me." Emma's response was to throw her arms around him and hold tight, and Richard, watching from the doorway, smiled and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, because sometimes families weren't about blood, they were about choices, about who you stood with when everything was falling apart, about who you trusted when trust was the hardest thing in the world. The second major twist came on the 2-year anniversary of that first night, when Marcus received a package at the penthouse, unmarked, hand-delivered, and when he opened it he found a USB drive and a note in handwriting he recognized, Patricia Morrison's, and the note said simply, "You need to know the truth about your family." Marcus stared at the note, his hands shaking because he'd never told anyone about his family, had never mentioned that before Afghanistan he'd had a wife and a daughter, both supposedly killed in a car accident while he was deployed, an accident that had devastated him, that had made him reckless in the field hospital, that had been part of why he'd pushed so hard to expose the drug testing, because he'd had nothing left to lose. But now this note suggested something impossible, something that changed everything. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop, and what he found there shattered his understanding of his entire life. Medical records showing his wife Sarah and daughter Claire entering witness protection 24 years ago, financial records showing regular payments from a Department of Defense black budget account, surveillance footage from various locations showing 2 women, an older one and a younger one, living quiet lives under assumed names, and finally, a video file dated 1 week ago, showing a woman in her late 50s sitting in what looked like a modest living room, and when she spoke, Marcus's heart stopped because it was Sarah's voice, older but unmistakable. "Marcus, if you're watching this, then Patricia's backup plan activated. Then she's been caught and decided to burn everything down, including the lies that kept us safe," Sarah said on the video, and Marcus's hands were shaking so hard he could barely keep the laptop steady. "The car accident was faked. Patricia arranged it, said that the people behind the drug testing knew about us, were planning to use us as leverage against you, and the only way to keep us safe was to make us disappear, to make you think we were dead so you'd never try to find us. And I went along with it because I was terrified, because Claire was only 5 years old and they showed me photographs of what happened to other people's families, and I thought losing you was better than losing our daughter." Marcus couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only watch as Sarah continued. "Patricia told me that you'd eventually be killed in the field, that it was inevitable given how reckless you'd become, and when news of the explosion came, when they said you were dead, I grieved, but I also thought maybe you'd finally found peace. But now I know that was a lie too, that you survived, that you've been living undercover for over 20 years, and Marcus, I am so sorry, sorry for letting Patricia convince me. Sorry for not fighting harder. Sorry for all the years you thought you'd lost us." The video showed Claire then, a young woman in her late 20s, beautiful and strong and carrying Sarah's smile in Marcus's eyes, and she said simply, "Dad, I don't remember you, I was too young. But Mom's told me stories my whole life, and I'd like to meet you if you want to meet me, if you can forgive what we let happen." The video ended and Marcus sat in stunned silence, and that's how Richard found him 20 minutes later, still staring at the blank screen, tears streaming down his face, and when Richard asked what was wrong, Marcus couldn't speak, could only turn the laptop around and play the video again, and Richard watched, and when it finished he looked at Marcus with something like awe. "They're alive," Richard said softly. "Your family is alive. All this time you thought you'd lost them, thought you were alone, but they're alive." Marcus nodded, still unable to speak, and Richard pulled out his phone and made a call, and within hours they had addresses, had confirmation that Sarah and Claire Webb, now living as Sarah and Claire Mitchell, were indeed in witness protection, were indeed alive and safe, and Richard, using resources that probably weren't strictly legal, arranged for them to be brought to New York, to the penthouse, under security that would make presidential protection look casual. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the penthouse living room, Richard and Emma having graciously made themselves scarce, and he waited for the elevator to arrive, for the doors to open, for his wife and daughter to step out, and when they did, when he saw Sarah's face, older but still beautiful, still the woman he'd loved, and Claire's face, a stranger who carried pieces of him and Sarah in her features, He felt 23 years of grief and loss and loneliness crack open. And Sarah was crying and saying his name, and Claire was looking at him with wonder and uncertainty. And Marcus didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge decades of separation. So he just said the only true thing he could. I thought I'd lost you forever. Sarah crossed the distance between them, and she put her hands on his face and she said, I thought I'd lost you too, but we're here now, we're alive, and we have time, Marcus, we have time to figure this out, to rebuild, to be a family again if you want that. Marcus looked at her, at Claire standing nervously behind her mother, at these two people who were his family but also strangers, who'd lived entire lives without him while he'd been hiding and grieving and trying to survive. And he thought about Emma, who'd called him Uncle Marcus, about Richard, who'd become his brother in all but blood, about the new life he'd built from the ashes of the old one. And he realized something profound. You could have more than one family, could love more than one set of people, could build new connections without betraying old ones. And maybe that was the real justice, the real redemption, not the trials or the convictions or the reforms, but the chance to love again after loss, to trust again after betrayal, to hope again after decades of hiding. I want that, Marcus said. I want all of it, want to know you both, want to try to build something from the ruins Patricia left behind. And I want you to meet people who became my family when I thought I'd never have one again. He called for Richard and Emma, and when they emerged from the other room, when introductions were made and stories were shared and tears and laughter mixed together in that strange alchemy of reunion, Marcus understood that this was what he'd been fighting for all along. Not abstract justice or institutional reform or moral victory, but this, people he loved, safe and together, with a future that held possibility instead of fear. The media found out eventually, because secrets that big couldn't stay buried, and the headlines screamed about the miracle reunion, about the surgeon who saved a billionaire and got his family back, about the little girl whose courage started a chain of events that brought down a murder network and reunited a family separated by lies. But Marcus ignored most of it, focused instead on learning who Sarah had become, on getting to know Claire, who was brilliant and funny and nothing like the 5-year-old he remembered but everything he could have hoped for, on helping Emma adjust to suddenly having an extended family, on supporting Richard as he rebuilt Caldwell Pharmaceuticals into something ethical and patient-focused. Months passed and life settled into something approaching normal, though normal looked very different now. Marcus worked at the research center, developing treatments that saved lives. Sarah started teaching again, this time at Columbia Medical School, where her decades of hidden expertise could finally be acknowledged. Claire became Richard's chief legal counsel, using her law degree and her intimate knowledge of witness protection to reform how vulnerable people were protected. Emma grew and thrived, surrounded by adults who loved her and would die to protect her. And Richard recovered fully from his poisoning, used his billions to fund the kind of systemic changes that made future Patricia Morrisons and Jonathan Whitmores less likely to succeed. Marcus found himself in an strange position. He was famous now, recognized everywhere he went, invited to speak at conferences and on news programs, asked to consult on medical ethics and pharmaceutical reform, and he did some of it, used his visibility to push for changes he believed in, but mostly he just tried to live, to make up for lost time, to be present for the people who mattered. One evening, about 3 years after Emma had come running to him in that hospital corridor, Marcus sat on the penthouse balcony watching the sun set over Manhattan, and Emma climbed into the chair beside him, now 11 years old and already showing signs of the remarkable woman she'd become, and she said quietly, Uncle Marcus, do you ever wish you just stayed a janitor? Like, that none of this had happened and you were still invisible and safe. Marcus thought about it seriously because Emma deserved serious answers, and he said, sometimes I think about how much simpler that life was, how much less complicated, but then I think about you, about how terrified you were that night, about how you trusted me enough to ask for help, and I realized that if I'd ignored you, if I'd chosen safety over action, your dad would be dead. And you'd have spent the rest of your life knowing that adults failed you when you needed them most, and I couldn't live with that, so no, I don't wish I'd stayed a janitor. Because being visible and complicated and in danger is better than being safe while people I could save are dying. Emma nodded slowly, processing this, and then she said, I'm glad you believed me. I'm glad you were brave, because you're my favorite person in the whole world, and I don't want to imagine my life without you in it. Marcus felt his eyes burn, felt the weight of that trust and love, and he pulled Emma close and held her, this child who'd saved him as much as he'd saved her, who'd reminded him that hiding from life wasn't the same as living it, who'd given him back his purpose when he'd thought purpose was lost forever. Richard joined them on the balcony later, bringing coffee and the easy comfort of friendship forged in crisis, and the three of them sat together watching the city lights come on, and Richard said, "I've been thinking about something, a way to honor Davis and all the other people who died because of this network, and I want your opinion." Marcus looked at him, curious, and Richard continued, "I want to establish a foundation, something that investigates suspicious deaths in medical settings, that provides legal support to families who suspect their loved ones were murdered, that trains medical professionals to recognize the patterns of systematic elimination, and I want you to run it, Marcus, you and Sarah together, using everything you've learned to prevent future Patricia Morrisons from succeeding." Marcus considered this, seeing the shape of it, understanding that this was Richard's way of ensuring the fight continued, that the exposure and the trials and the convictions weren't the end but the beginning of something larger. "That would mean staying visible," Marcus said. "Staying in the public eye, being a target for anyone who wants revenge or wants to protect what remains of the network." Richard nodded. "It would, yes, but you'd have resources, protection, a platform to actually make change instead of just surviving, and Marcus, you've spent 23 years hiding, don't you think it's time to spend the rest of your life fighting?" Marcus looked at Emma, at Richard, at the life he'd built and the family he'd found, and he thought about all the people who died quietly, whose deaths had been accepted as tragic but explicable, who'd never had anyone willing to ask difficult questions or challenge powerful interests, and he made his final choice, the one that would define whatever years he had left. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay, let's do it. Let's build something that makes sure no one else's father gets poisoned in a hospital room, that no other 8-year-old has to run terrified through corridors looking for help, that no other family gets separated by lies and manipulation. Let's build something that matters." Richard smiled and Emma squeezed Marcus's hand, and somewhere in the city below, someone was probably planning something terrible, some elimination of some inconvenient person, some quiet murder that would look like natural causes, but now there would be people watching, people who knew the patterns, people who wouldn't accept the easy explanations, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to save a life, to prevent a tragedy, to ensure that the next time a child came running for help, there would be someone willing to believe them and act. The foundation launched 6 months later, funded by a significant portion of Richard's fortune, staffed by investigators and medical professionals and legal experts who understood that fighting systematic corruption required systematic resistance, and within the first year they'd identified 3 suspicious death patterns at major hospitals, had gotten 2 cases reopened, had saved at least 1 life when they flagged a patient who was being slowly poisoned, and Marcus watched it grow, watched the impact multiply, and understood that this was his legacy now, not the trauma surgeries he'd performed decades ago, not the soldiers he'd saved in Afghanistan, but this ongoing work to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, to ensure that profits never again mattered more than people. Sarah worked alongside him, bringing her own expertise and perspective, and Marcus discovered that falling in love again with someone you'd loved before was different from first love, was deeper and more complicated and shot through with loss and regret, but also with gratitude for second chances. And they rebuilt their marriage slowly, carefully, learning each other again, adjusting to the people they'd become during their decades apart. Claire became part of the foundation's legal team, and Emma declared at age 13 that she was going to be a doctor when she grew up, that she was going to learn everything Uncle Marcus could teach her, and Marcus saw the cycle continuing, saw the next generation being shaped by the lessons of the past, saw hope in the determination of young people who understood that the world needed fighting for. 5 years after that first night, on the anniversary that had become a private holiday for their unconventional family, they gathered at the penthouse, Marcus and Sarah, Richard and Emma, Claire and her partner, a few close friends who'd become part of their circle, and they raised glasses to absent friends, to Davis who'd sacrificed himself so others could live, to all the victims whose deaths had finally been acknowledged, to the idea that sometimes ordinary people doing extraordinary things could actually change the world. Emma, now 13 and growing into the remarkable person everyone had known she'd become, stood up to make a toast, and she looked at Marcus with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years, and she said, 5 years ago I was terrified and desperate and I ran to a janitor because he was the only person who looked at me like I mattered, and that choice changed everything. Changed my life and my dad's life and Uncle Marcus's life and honestly probably hundreds of other lives because of what happened after. And I guess what I want to say is that sometimes the most important thing we can do is just believe people when they ask for help, just trust that they're telling the truth even when it seems impossible, just choose to act instead of hiding, because you never know what might happen when you choose courage over safety. The room was silent for a moment, everyone processing the profound truth in a teenager's words. And then they drank, and the conversation resumed, and life went on as it always does. But Marcus caught Richard's eye across the room and saw the same thought reflected there. That little girl had saved them all, had reminded them what mattered, had proven that innocence and trust and desperate courage could overcome even the most sophisticated evil. Later that night, after everyone had left, Marcus stood in the penthouse looking out at the city, and Sarah came to stand beside him, and they held hands and watched the lights, and Marcus thought about all the lives lived in those buildings, all the quiet dramas and desperate struggles, all the times someone needed help and didn't know where to turn, and he felt the weight of it but also the purpose, because now there was a foundation, now there were people watching, now there was a little less darkness than there used to be. "Do you think we've done enough?" Sarah asked quietly, and Marcus considered the question seriously, because Sarah deserved serious answers. "No," he said finally. "We'll never have done enough. There will always be more people who need help, more corruption to expose, more systems to reform, but I think we've done something, and maybe that's all anyone can really do, just something, just enough to make the world a little better than we found it, and trust that others will keep pushing forward when we can't anymore." Sarah nodded, and they stood in comfortable silence, two people who'd lost each other and found each other again, who'd survived betrayal and trauma and decades of separation, who'd built new lives from the ashes of old ones, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the peace of finished work or completed missions, but the peace of knowing that he'd made the right choices, that he'd stood with the right people, that he'd believed a little girl when she'd come to him, desperate and terrified, and that single choice had cascaded into everything that followed. The story could end there, with peace and purpose and family and hope, but life doesn't work that way. Life keeps going with all its complications and challenges, and Marcus knew that tomorrow there would be new cases to investigate, new families to support, new fights to fight, but tonight, standing with Sarah, knowing that Richard and Emma were safe, knowing that Claire was building her own life, knowing that the foundation was making a difference, tonight was enough, tonight was everything. And Marcus allowed himself to simply be grateful for it, for all of it, for the little girl who'd trusted a janitor, for the billionaire who'd offered friendship, for the wife and daughter who'd come back from the dead, for the chance to do work that mattered, for the opportunity to be visible and vulnerable and purposeful instead of hidden and safe and slowly dying inside. Years would pass, the foundation would grow, Emma would become a doctor, Claire would continue her advocacy work, Richard would age gracefully while ensuring his fortune was used for good, Sarah would become a respected voice in medical ethics, and Marcus would keep fighting, keep believing, keep choosing action over safety until the day he couldn't anymore. And when that day came, whenever it came, he would be able to look back and know that his life had meant something, that he'd saved lives. Not just with surgical skill but with moral courage, that he'd proven you could come back from hiding, could rebuild from destruction, could choose to matter even when mattering was dangerous. But that was years away, decades maybe, and tonight Marcus was just a man standing with his wife, grateful for second chances, surrounded by chosen family, doing work that mattered, visible and purposeful and alive in ways he hadn't been for 23 years. And if someone had told him 5 years ago that believing one terrified child would lead to all of this, to justice and reunion and purpose and hope, he might not have believed them, but he would have believed the child anyway, because that's what you do when someone asks for help. You believe them, you act, you choose courage over safety, and you trust that somehow, impossibly, it will be enough.